Pilot podcasts. A queen throws a banquet, refuses one command from her husband, and is erased from the story forever, replaced by a woman specifically chosen because she would never say no. That is the opening of the Book of Esther, and somehow Hollywood has spent decades turning it into a straightforward love story. Today, we're digging into what a cinematic, realist retelling of Vashti and Esther would actually look like. Why the film adaptations we have fundamentally misread the source material, what scholars say these two women really represent, and what it would take to finally get this story right on screen. Joining me is someone who has gone deep on the intersection of biblical narrative and cinema, and I want to start right at the beginning. Who are these two women, and why does the relationship between them matter so much?
So the thing that immediately strikes you when you actually read the Book of Esther is that Vashti and Esther never meet. Vashti is gone by the end of chapter 1. And yet, as scholar Wendy Amsalem, writing for My Jewish Learning, puts it, Vashti casts a long shadow over the rest of the book.
She's absent, but she's everywhere.
Exactly. And to understand why, you have to understand what each woman represents in the text. Vashti is described as beautiful and headstrong. She throws her own banquet, and when King Ahasuerus commands her to appear before him and his guests, essentially to be displayed, she refuses. That's it. That's her entire story. And for that refusal, she loses her crown and is permanently banished.
One act of refusal and she's out.
One act. And the text makes the stakes explicit. The final verse of chapter 1 sends a decree to all of Ahasuerus' subjects that, quote, every man must rule in his household. Vashti's punishment isn't just personal, it's political. It's a message sent empire-wide.
So Esther enters into that context, into a court that has just made an example of a woman for saying no.
Right, and Amsalem's analysis is really sharp here. She points out that Esther is presented as the perfect foil to Vashti. Where Vashti was willful and independent, Esther is passive and submissive. And there's this Hebrew word, lakach, that gets applied to Esther repeatedly throughout the text. It means taken. She is taken in by Mordecai as a foster daughter, taken to the king's harem, taken before the king.
Wait, the same word over and over?
Over and over. She doesn't reveal her identity because Mordecai commanded her not to. She requests nothing at the harem, only accepting whatever the king's eunuch chooses to give her. Even after she's crowned queen, she continues to obey Mordecai's commands. Ahasuerus loves her because she is, as Amsalem puts it, the model of docility, an exact antidote to Vashti.
So she was essentially selected because she was the opposite of the woman who said no.
That's the text's own logic. And here's where it gets genuinely complex, because Esther does eventually act. Mordecai commands her to appear before the king unsummoned to plead for the Jewish people, and she knows that appearing before the king unbidden is punishable by death. She has learned from Vashti's fate. Her position, her identity, possibly her life, all of it is tied to her obedience.
So she's caught between two impossible loyalties.
Exactly. Amsalem describes it as a crisis. She's caught between conflicting obediences to her foster father and her husband. And to go before the king unsummoned is to become Vashti. It's to step into the role of the woman who was erased.
That is a genuinely cinematic tension. That's the kind of thing that makes great drama.
It really is. And here's the thing. The Book of Esther has this wild reception history that makes it even more interesting as source material. No copy of Esther was found among the Dead Sea Scrolls, and scholars believe that's not accidental. The book was disputed in Rabbinic Judaism and early Christianity.
Disputed how?
Well, scholar Kevin McGeough, writing in the Journal of Bible and Its Reception, notes that Martin Luther famously lamented what he saw as Judaic and pagan elements in the work and wished the book didn't exist. John Calvin tried to will it into non-existence by never writing a commentary on it and rarely citing it.
That is a bold strategy. Just pretend the book isn't there.
Right? And McGeough suggests it might be the absence of God in the Hebrew original, the prominence of women, or the call for genocide at the end that inspired so much discomfort. The mixed reviews have continued well into the 21st century.
So it's a book that has always made people uncomfortable, and yet it keeps getting adapted into these very comfortable, very safe films.
That's exactly the tension McGeough is examining. He looks at two major cinematic adaptations, Esther and the King from 1960 and One Night with the King from 2006, and his argument is that both films transform the story to suit the genre expectations of the biblical epic and the perspectives of their intended viewers.
So they're making it more palatable.
More palatable, more heroic, more conventional. And Magot's core argument is that Esther is best understood as a carnivalesque work, subversive, comedic, satirical, and the cinematic adaptations have completely stripped that out.
Carnivalesque, can you unpack that a bit? Because that's not how most people think about this story.
So the carnivalesque as a literary concept is about inversion, the powerful brought low, the marginalized elevated, social hierarchies turned upside down. And the Book of Esther is full of that. A Jewish orphan girl becomes queen. The villain Haman ends up hanged on the very gallows he built for Mordecai. The king is essentially a buffoon being manipulated by everyone around him. It's almost satirical.
And the films flatten all of that into a straightforward heroic narrative.
They do. McGee argues that these new readings of Esther are particularly influential precisely because film reaches mass audiences, people who may never engage with scholarly or confessional commentary. And that's a point Rhonda Burnett Blech makes in the Journal of Bible and its Reception as well. She argues it's probable that more people today are exposed to and influenced by filmic representations of the Bible than by any other source.
So the film version becomes the version. It shapes how people understand the story.
Burnett Blech calls this filmic exegesis, the idea that filmmakers and film viewers are both active readers of biblical texts, interpreting them through their own cultural moment. The film isn't just adapting the story, it's making an argument about what the story means.
And the argument the existing Esther films are making is, what exactly? That this is a love story, a heroic rescue narrative?
Essentially, yes. And in doing so, they tend to sideline Vashti almost entirely, or they make her a minor villain, the difficult wife who had to go. Which is actually consistent with how traditional rabbinic commentary treated her.
Right, because the rabbis weren't fans of Vashti either.
Not at all. Scholar Anat Koplowitz-Breyer, writing in Literature and Theology in July 2025, notes that traditional exegesis has overwhelmingly portrayed Vashti in negative terms, as disobedient, immoral, and deservedly punished. The rabbis essentially agreed with Ahasuerus.
So for centuries, the official interpretation was, she had it coming.
For centuries. And what Koplowitz-Breyer's research tracks is how contemporary Jewish American women poets have been systematically dismantling that reading through what she calls midrashic poetry, creative retellings that fill in the gaps the biblical text leaves open.
Midrash, that's the tradition of interpretive storytelling, right? Filling in what the text doesn't say.
Exactly. And Koplowitz-Breyer applies two frameworks to analyze this poetry. One is Alicia Ostriker's Hermeneutics of Indeterminacy, the idea that the text's silences and gaps are openings for new meaning. The other is Wendy Zierler's Hermeneutics of Identification, reading the text through the lens of your own experience and identity.
So these poets are essentially doing what a cinematic realist would need to do, inhabiting the gaps.
That's a really precise way to put it. And what Koplowitz-Breyer finds is that across 3 decades of this poetry, Vashti is transformed from a cautionary tale into what she calls a feminist foremother. An autonomous subject reclaiming her voice, a woman whose ancient no-no resonates with contemporary feminist movements, including explicitly with Nuber Me Too.
That's a striking reframe. The woman who was erased from the story becomes the origin point of a whole tradition of resistance.
And David Zucker, writing in the journal Women in Judaism in 2023, frames it through 3 lenses: Vashti as victim, Vashti as vilified, and Vashti as venerated. He has this line that I think is really powerful. Vashti never speaks, yet her actions speak loud and clear.
She never speaks in the entire text.
Not a single line of dialogue. We only know she refused. We don't know why. We don't know what she thought. We don't know what happened to her after. The text just moves on. And that silence is exactly what a cinematic, realist retelling would have to reckon with.
Because realism demands interiority. It demands that you show us what's happening inside a character, not just what they do.
Right. And that's where the methodology that Wesley Newman developed at Liberty University becomes interesting. He calls it Cinematic Biblical Translation, or CBT. His 2026 thesis argues that biblical narratology and contemporary screenwriting can be married into a methodology for translating Hebrew narratives into screenplays that remain faithful to the text while being genuinely engaging on screen.
So there's actually a scholarly framework for doing this kind of adaptation responsibly.
There is. Newman draws on biblical narratology, which looks at the literary structure and narrative logic of ancient Hebrew storytelling, and combines it with contemporary screenwriting theory. The argument is that these two fields aren't as far apart as you'd think. Pedersen Bray, writing in the journal Polygraphy in 2024, makes a similar point, that the narrative structure of the Hebrew Bible aligns methodologically with the storytelling techniques of modern cinema.
That's actually kind of wild when you think about it. The Bible was already doing things that cinema would later figure out.
Bray draws on scholars like Robert Alter and Adele Berlin to make that case, that biblical narratives convey meaning through both form and content, that character-driven and plot-driven structures create different kinds of audience engagement. These are the same conversations happening in film school.
So what would a genuinely realist Vashti and Esther film actually look like if you applied all of this? Like, what would it have to do differently?
A few things. First, it would have to give Vashti a voice, not just a refusal, but a reason, an interiority. The Midrashic poetry tradition has been doing this for decades, imagining what she was thinking, what she feared, what she wanted. A realist film would need to do the same.
And that's a genuinely hard creative problem because the text gives you almost nothing to work with.
Which is exactly why Koplowitz-Breyer's framework of hermeneutics of indeterminacy is useful. The gaps aren't a problem, they're an invitation. A realist filmmaker would have to make choices about who Vashti is, and those choices would be interpretive acts. That's what Burnett Bletch means by filmic exegesis.
And then there's the question of Esther herself, because she's not straightforwardly heroic either, right? She's a much more complicated figure than the films have made her.
Much more complicated. Amsellem's analysis is really clear on this. Esther is initially the model of docility. She was chosen specifically because she was the antithesis of Vashti. And the crisis she faces when Mordecai commands her to go before the king is genuinely terrifying. She knows what happened to the last queen who defied expectations.
She's not brave in the way a superhero is brave. She's brave in the way someone is brave when they're genuinely terrified and they do it anyway.
And that's a much more interesting kind of courage to put on screen. The existing films tend to make Esther's heroism feel inevitable. She's the chosen one. She's going to save her people. Of course she does it. But the text is much more ambivalent. Her position, her identity, her life, all of it is at stake.
And then there's the Carmelasque element that Magot argues the films have completely abandoned, the satirical, subversive quality of the original.
Right. A realist retelling wouldn't necessarily be a comedy, but it would need to honor the fact that the king is kind of a fool, that Haman's downfall is almost farcical, that the whole structure of the story is about power being inverted. The biblical epic genre doesn't allow for that. It needs its kings to be majestic and its villains to be menacing.
So the genre itself is part of the problem.
Magot makes exactly that argument. The genre expectations of the biblical epic, the sweeping score, the grand sets, the heroic protagonist, are fundamentally at odds with what the Book of Esther is actually doing. A realist approach would strip all of that away.
Think smaller. Think closer. Think about what it actually felt like to be a woman in that court.
Exactly. And that's where the word lakakh becomes so important cinematically. If you're a realist filmmaker, and you understand that Esther is described as taken at every stage of her life, taken by Mordecai, taken to the harem, taken before the king, you make that visible. You make the audience feel the weight of that passivity, the way agency is stripped from her.
That's the kind of detail that changes everything in a film. One repeated word in the source text becomes a visual motif.
And it connects directly to the Meber Me Too resonance that Koplowitz-Breyer identifies in the contemporary poetry about Vashti. These poets are reading Vashti's refusal as a refusal to be objectified, to be displayed for the male gaze. That reading lands very differently in 2026 than it did in 1960 when the first major film adaptation came out.
The cultural moment shapes what the story can mean.
That's Burnett Bletch's whole point about filmic exegesis. The filmmaker is a situated reader, interpreting the text through their own cultural context. A film made in 2026 about Vashti and Esther would inevitably be in conversation with everything that's happened around gender, power, and consent in the last decade.
And that's not a distortion of the text. That's actually how the text has always worked. It's always been read through the lens of the present.
Zucker makes that point in his Women in Judaism article, Both the rabbis and the contemporary poets are trying to make Vashti relevant to their readership. They approach her differently, but the goal is the same: to make the audience understand why this woman matters, why her story is important to know.
And the film hasn't been made yet. Not really. Not in the way we're describing.
Not yet. And I think that absence is itself meaningful. The Book of Esther has been adapted multiple times, but always through the lens of the biblical epic, always in a way that makes it more comfortable, more conventional, more palatable. A genuinely realist retelling that centers Vashti's silence and Esther's terror and the carnival-esque absurdity of the court, that film hasn't been made.
So when you step back from everything we've covered, the feminist scholarship, the cinematic theory, the reception history, here's what this really comes down to. We have a story that has been misread for centuries, and the films have compounded that misreading.
That's the core of it. Traditional exegesis vilified Vashti. The films sidelined her. And in doing so, they also flattened Esther, turned her crisis into a triumph, her terror into courage that feels easy rather than costly. The scholarship is pointing toward a much richer, much more uncomfortable version of this story.
And the tools exist to tell it. Newman's cinematic biblical translation methodology, Bray's work on the convergence of biblical narrative and film structure, Burnett Bletcher's framework of filmic exegesis. There's a whole scholarly apparatus for doing this responsibly.
The intellectual groundwork is there. What's missing is the film. And maybe that's the provocation. The story of two queens who shaped each other without ever meeting, one erased and one celebrated, is still waiting for the cinematic realist who's willing to sit with that discomfort instead of resolving it.
Vashti never spoke in the text. She just refused. And somehow, that silence has been generating conversation for thousands of years. Maybe the most honest thing a film could do is let that silence breathe and let the audience feel the weight of what it cost her. That's the episode. Thanks for being here on Copilot Podcasts, and we'll see you next time.